It's now been over 30 years since hackers first started extorting companies by infecting their computer systems with viruses and then demanding that the companies make ransom payments in order to have the viruses removed. And at this point, a lot of companies just view these payments as a cost of doing business. And banks see these payments going out all the time. But earlier this month, the Department of the Treasury made an announcement that anyone who makes this type of payment can be subject to a civil penalty if the payment is made to an individual or entity that is on Treasury's sanctions list. And this is particularly troubling because neither banks nor the victims generally know who hacked the account and who the payment is ultimately going to. And so this puts companies and financial institutions in a really tough spot. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about what exactly OFAC said in their new announcement, and then talk about what financial institutions and victims of cyber attacks can do to mitigate the risk that they'll face these type of penalties from OFAC down the line. In its October 1st announcement, OFAC pointed out that it already has designated numerous malicious cyber actors as part of its sanctions program. And it pointed specifically to Evil Corp, which is a Russian-based entity that was added to the sanctions list in December of last year. It noted that payments to those sanctioned entities are illegal, and that it can impose civil penalties for payments to those sanctioned entities, even if the person making the payment does not know or does not even have reason to know that the payment is going to somebody who's on the sanctions list. And so this creates a very difficult decision for companies whose systems are hacked and face a demand to make a ransomware payment. They either have to refuse to make that payment and risk that they aren't going to regain control of their systems, and in some cases that the data of their customers are going to be released to the public, or they could make the payment and risk that OFAC is going to impose a civil penalty on them. And these risks are particularly acute for financial institutions who can potentially face civil penalties merely for facilitating the payment to a sanctioned individual or an entity or a country that is on the sanctions list. There are a number of things that a corporate victim of a ransomware attack can do to minimize the risk that it will face penalties from OFAC for inadvertently making a payment to someone on the sanctions list. The first is to have a risk-based compliance program that specifically addresses the risk of making payments to someone on the sanctions list. That's something that OFAC has specifically said that it will take into consideration when it's deciding whether or not to engage in an enforcement action and impose a penalty on somebody that inadvertently makes a payment to an individual on the sanctions list. The second is to promptly report the existence of the cyber attack and the ransomware demand to law enforcement. And the third is to cooperate fully with law enforcement as it's investigating that violation. So at this point, it's too early to know exactly how OFAC is going to weigh each of those factors, but we do know that each of them should reduce the risk of facing a civil penalty for inadvertent payments to an entity on the sanctions list. Like victims of ransomware attacks, banks and payments companies at which the victims hold accounts are potentially at risk of being penalized by OFAC. And they should take the same steps that I outlined earlier to minimize this risk. They should promptly report ransomware attacks when they learn of them. They should cooperate fully with law enforcement in connection with the investigation. And finally, they need to have an adequate compliance program. And what that means is having a compliance program that adopts policies and procedures that specifically address the risk that an account holder will make a payment in response to a ransomware demand to an entity on the sanctions list. For example, if you have account holders that are digital forensics companies that are often involved in making ransomware payments, you should adopt special procedures to monitor those accounts. And similarly, if you have accounts that are making transfers associated with cryptocurrency, you might even want to consider having a blockchain forensics tool that can be used to identify suspicious transfers. In addition, it's important for regulated entities to keep in mind their responsibility to file suspicious activity reports. And earlier this month, FinCEN actually issued a new guidance specifying when and how those suspicious activity reports need to be filed in connection with these types of cyber events. So at this point, there's a lot of ambiguity on exactly how OFAC is going to be interpreting these regulations. And it's particularly risky because often there's just a matter of hours between when the demand is made, when the decision to pay is made, and when the decision to process the payment is made. So there's a lot of risk, there's not a lot of time. But there's some good news. I'm a lawyer. So if you do have any questions about how to address the risks of ransomware attacks and how to address OFAC's new statement concerning when it will be imposing penalties on victims and financial institutions, give me a call. I'd be happy to talk to you.